Hello there, welcome to my channel. And today I have a very special treat for you. This is a new story that I am reading for the first time, and I am gone, tell it to you very slowly so you can relax and drift off to sleep while listening to it. The story is called The Girl Who Walked Between the Worlds, and it's a tale about the first people who populated the Americas, and it is part of a series called We Are the People. I will be reading the first 3 books in this series for you, and posting them here so you can listen to them whenever you like. So let's begin our journey together. Thousands of years ago, before there were any roads or cities, or even countries, the world was quiet. Everything was covered in snow and ice, and the only sounds you could hear were the wind and the crunching of snow under your feet. There were no cars or planes or loud noises of any kind. It was an extremely long time ago, a time when humans were just beginning to spread out across the planet. And if you walked far enough east from where Siberia meets Alaska, you would find a land bridge connecting the 2 continents. If you walked all the way down it, you would find yourself in a place unlike anything you had ever seen before. A huge, flat grassland full of plants and animals you had never seen before. The girl's name is Alina, and she lives with her family in a small village made up of tents and huts. Her grandmother has told her stories about the land to the west. She has told her of great herds of animals, of lush green grass, and of trees taller than any mountains. Alina has always wanted to see this magical place for herself. So one day she asks her parents if they can move their village to the west. But her parents shake their heads. They have heard stories from their grandparents about the lands beyond their own, and they are afraid. According to those stories, the sun and the moon live in the west, and it is forbidden for humans to go there. But Alina cannot stop thinking about the stories her grandmother has told her. Every night before she goes to bed, she looks up at the sun and the moon, and asks them to show her the magical lands they live in. One night, while everyone in the village is asleep, Alina sneaks out of her tent, and runs as fast as she can toward the west. She doesn't know what she will find there, but she is determined to find out. As she runs, the wind whips past her, carrying with it the scent of pine trees, and the sound of running water. She runs until she can't run anymore, and collapses on the ground, exhausted. When she looks up, she sees the most beautiful sight she has ever seen. Before her lies a vast, endless grassland, and in the distance, she can see tall, majestic mountains. "Welcome to Bering," Alina says to herself. But as she takes in the beauty of her surroundings, she realizes that she is all alone. She calls out for her family, but no one answers. She walks for hours, but all she finds are herds of strange animals and plants she has never seen before. Just when she is about to give up hope of ever seeing her family again, she hears a familiar sound, the sound of human voices. She runs toward the voices, and soon finds herself face to face with her family and other villagers. They had been looking for her everywhere, and when they saw her standing there, they ran to her and hugged her tightly. Alina had found the magical land her grandmother had told her about, but she had also found something else, a new home. Now, where did Alina come from? Where did the people who populated the Americas come from? What about the animals? How did they get there? Well, that's gonna have to wait till next time, because it's time to go to sleep now. I hope you enjoyed this little intro to The Girl Who Walked Between the Worlds. In the next episode, we're going to talk more about where Alina and her family came from and how they got to the Americas. It's going to be a wild ride, so make sure you tune in next time. Until then, just close your eyes and imagine the cold winds whipping through your hair as you stand on that frozen bridge between Asia and North America, thousands of years ago. Imagine the crunch of the snow under your boots as you take your first step into the unknown. What do you see in front of you? What do you hear? What does it feel like? Take your time and really imagine it. You can pause this video and come back to it anytime. Just close your eyes and let your imagination run wild. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye. The world is colder now than it has been for at least 20,000 years. The last ice age began when our distant ancestors were making cave paintings and ended before the first pyramids were built. I'm going to tell you about the ice sheet that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Pole, carving out the Great Lakes and leaving behind giant ice shelves over central Siberia. I'll take you to frozen wastelands where woolly mammoths roamed, and I'll show you what the rest of the world looked like back then. But I need you to do something for me. Since there are no videos or pictures from this time period, we're going to use your imagination. All I ask is that you listen to the way I describe the ice sheet, the frozen landscapes, and the lowered sea levels. If you let yourself be transported back in time, you can see with your mind's eye a world locked in ice. Let's start here. This is northeastern Siberia, an area so barren and frozen that even today there are no towns anywhere near this spot. In fact, there aren't any settlements for hundreds of miles in any direction. Imagine it covered by a thick layer of ice, snow, and permafrost. As far as the eye could see, stretching in every direction, endless white plains without a single tree, rock, or sign of life. It's hard to fathom, but just below this ice sheet was once the fourth largest ocean on Earth. Its name was the Arctic Ocean, but because it was covered by such a thick sheet of ice, most of it had become a frozen wasteland. The only signs of life here would have been small mammals like squirrels, lemmings, and maybe even some species of deer. But most of the larger animals had migrated south. Even woolly mammoths avoided this region during the Ice Age. As we move south, the landscape begins to change. Rolling hills replace the flat tundra, but the terrain is still completely covered in ice. We're still in Siberia, but we've reached the southern edge of the ice sheet. From this point, the glaciers begin to thin, but they're still hundreds of feet thick. This would have been a terrible place to live. Winters lasted most of the year, and temperatures frequently dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The only animals that lived here permanently were creatures specially adapted to the cold like reindeer, foxes, wolves, and wild horses. Humans would occasionally pass through this region following herds of animals to hunt, but they would never stay long. We're now standing in northern China, and the glaciers are beginning to disappear entirely. The weather is still freezing cold, but the ice sheet is gone, and we can see the ground for the first time. It looks like a dry, cracked desert. There aren't many trees, but the hardy plants that do grow here are the ancestors of modern shrubs and small flowering plants. Animals from the south, like antelopes and wild cattle, are starting to migrate north into this territory. There are also a few large predators, but none are as fearsome as the short-faced bear. This enormous creature is an ancestor of the modern polar bear, and even though it's not quite as big as its descendant, it's still twice the size of a grizzly bear. For thousands of years, it hunted wild horses, reindeer, and other mammals that migrated through this region before winter set in again. As we continue our journey south, the landscape changes again. First, rolling grasslands replace the desert. Then, in the distance, we can see mountains. Not just any mountains, the Himalayas. But something's different here. They look much closer. That's because the glaciers have melted enough to reveal new land between Asia and North America. Back then, humans didn't know that this new landmass existed. They thought Asia and North America were still connected. They would have been shocked to discover that their world was much bigger than they thought. Here's another surprise. Look how close the Eurasian islands are to the coast of California. This is Japan, and even though it looks close, it would still take months to sail there from the west coast of America. In fact, it would take months to sail anywhere, since ships couldn't travel across the ocean in those days. This means that most people never saw the ocean. They spent their entire lives looking at land. When you think about it, it makes sense why so many civilizations developed along rivers. People back then had no idea how big the world really was. This is Greenland, and its name is misleading. Even though it's called Greenland, it wasn't green. It was mostly a barren, frozen island. Even so, it did have more vegetation than the other parts of the ice sheet, and that's why humans settled here. Back then, it was a popular place to stop on the long journey across the Atlantic. For the most part, though, Greenland was empty and desolate. Only birds, foxes, and a few species of whales and dolphins lived here. Humans had to leave eventually, because there was nothing to eat. Now we've arrived at the edge of North America. Looking north, we can see the ice sheet stretching all the way to Greenland. Looking west, we can see that it's attached to an even larger sheet of ice, covering most of Canada and the northern United States. This must have been a terrifying sight to behold. Just imagine how much noise it made as the wind howled across the frozen plains and crashed against the ice sheet. As we travel south, the ice begins to recede and the climate becomes warmer. This is the Great Lakes region, and the glaciers have carved out for huge lakes here. These lakes are filled with meltwater from the massive ice sheet to the north. At this time, most of the ice sheet is still intact, but it's beginning to break apart. Some pieces break off and fall into the ocean, but others remain on land. These are called ice shelves. Here's one in Siberia and another one in northern Canada. These shelves can last for thousands of years, but eventually they collapse, and the water rushes into the newly formed lake. This happens again and again, until the ice sheet is completely gone. This creates a huge problem for humans. Every 500 or 600 years, a giant ice shelf collapses and floods the surrounding areas. These sudden floods wipe out villages, destroy crops, and kill livestock. Humans living near the ice sheet are forced to abandon their homes and flee to lower ground. Some groups of humans are wiped out, but others learn how to adapt. One group of humans develops boats to navigate the newly formed lakes and seas. Others invent farming techniques to feed their people after the floods destroy their crops. Still, others develop weapons to defend themselves against dangerous animals seeking food. For the first time, humans learn how to adapt to the changing world. And that's how the world looked and sounded 20,000 years ago. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 1, A World Locked in Ice. If you want to hear the next chapter, please click the link on your screen. Thanks for watching. Alright, Chapter 2, The Birth of Bering. Let's do this thing. Okay, so in order to talk about how Bering formed, we have to go back thousands and thousands of years ago, to a time when the climate was very different than it is now. We're talking before the last ice age even started. Somewhere around 40,000 years ago, or maybe a little bit before that. And we're gonna have to imagine a landmass that looks something like this. You may be saying, wait a minute, where are the rest of the continents? They should be connected. Well, you're absolutely right. This is the current arrangement of the continents as we know them today. But once upon a time, the continents were all joined together in a supercontinent called Pangaea. As Pangaea began to break apart, the Atlantic Ocean started to form. Europe and Africa moved south and Asia started to move east. North America remained mostly stationary, but because the Earth is a sphere, as these other land masses moved away from it, it actually expanded its available shoreline. So North America's eastern seaboard was actually further north at that time. And that had significant effects on the environment, and would play a key role in the formation of the Bering Land Bridge. Okay, so fast forward back to 40,000 years ago. Now we're into the last ice age. It's cold. Most of the world is covered in ice. But there is an area right here at the top of North America that is free of ice, and it is warm. There's a mild, temperate rainforest. And that is thanks to the fact that this part of the world gets way more sunlight than it does today, because the Earth's axis is tilted. This extra sunlight is absorbed by the ocean water here, and it warms the water and the air above it. These warm temperatures allow for the formation of rainforests with lots of moisture, and it's just teeming with life. In fact, this place is probably one of the most biologically diverse places in the world at that time. It's sort of like the modern-day Amazon, or maybe the coral reefs. There are animals here that we recognize today, such as bison and deer, as well as ancestors of modern horses, dogs, bears, and wolves. There are also animals that we no longer see in this region, such as camels, llamas, and muskox. All of these animals are living in a lush temperate rainforest that receives over 200 inches of rain per year. So what happens next? Well, the Earth begins to warm up a little bit. It's still cold, and it's still an ice sheet, but it's starting to melt just a little bit. Now, as the ice melts, it doesn't melt uniformly. Instead, it melts faster on the equator and slower at the poles. And that leaves us with more water in the oceans. Because the melting is happening faster near the equator. The water level in the Atlantic Ocean rises faster than the water level in the Pacific Ocean. And that causes the sea level to rise on the eastern side of North America. With the rising sea levels comes new challenges for our temperate rainforest. Before it received 200 inches of rain per year. Now it only receives about 100 inches of rain per year. That's half as much. And after several thousand years of this trend continuing, the rainforest can no longer survive. All of this additional rainfall has caused the soil to become very acidic. With less rainfall to replenish the nutrients, the soil becomes a desert. Animals begin to die off. Some migrate, some adapt, and some go extinct. And with that, an entire ecosystem collapses. But it's not done yet. The rising water continues to trap more heat and more moisture, which leads to more rain. And this area quickly becomes a swamp. For several thousand years, this swamp is home to giant crocodiles and prehistoric whales, as well as early humans who have migrated here from Asia. But eventually, the Earth begins to warm up again, and the swamp evaporates entirely, leaving behind a salty sea. And with that, we are left with the Bering Sea. If you've been following along, you might have noticed that the coastline of North America has moved south quite a ways. If we take our current map of North America and move it down, so that the tip of Florida lines up with the tip of South America, you'll notice that the coast of Siberia lines up almost perfectly with the coast of Alaska. Well, this wasn't always the case. When the Earth warmed up and the ice melted, the entire Alaskan coast was exposed to the Pacific Ocean. The reason why we don't see this today is because during the Ice Age, the Arctic didn't have any ice in the Bering Sea, All of the ice was actually further south, and it extended all the way from Siberia to the coast of Alaska. This created a giant isthmus of exposed land connecting Siberia to Alaska, and that is the Bering Land Bridge. But just how big is the Bering Land Bridge? Well, let me put it this way. If we were to take the state of California and stretch it out horizontally, it would fit inside the Bering Land Bridge 3 times with barely any room to spare. So if you think about how big the state of California is, you can imagine how large the Bering Land Bridge must be, and that's only considering its width. If we measure its length, it's roughly 55 miles wide at its thinnest point, and 625 miles at its widest point. The average elevation is 980 feet above sea level. But what's really interesting is that the highest peak, Mount Shishelton, reaches an elevation of 9,286 feet, and that makes it taller than Mount Fuji. So when people talk about the Bering Land Bridge as being this narrow isthmus that connects Russia to the United States, that's completely false. The Bering Land Bridge is so wide that you could put 2 countries between the 2 oceans. In fact, if we were to imagine a country that was exactly the same size as the Bering Land Bridge, it would be the 35th largest country in the world. And if we were to add all of the countries smaller than the Bering Land Bridge, they would make up only about 6% of the total land area of the Bering Land Bridge. In other words, the Bering Land Bridge is so massive that it feels like a country rather than a bridge. But all good things must come to an end. And unfortunately, the Bering Land Bridge would not exist forever. Around 14,500 years ago, the ice started to melt again. And as the sea level rose, the Bering Land Bridge was submerged. Today, it exists as the Bering Strait, which separates the Arctic Ocean from the Pacific Ocean. However, scientists predict that as the planet warms up, the sea level will rise again and expose the Bering Land Bridge once again. And that's why I made this video. There are a lot of misconceptions about the Bering Land Bridge. A lot of people think it was a narrow isthmus that connected the 2 continents. And that's just not true. It was so wide that it would have felt like a country rather than a bridge. And the animals and plants that lived there would have felt the same way. The Bering Land Bridge was their entire world. And when it was gone, they either had to adapt or die. Speaking of which, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that thumbs up button, so that more people can learn about the amazing history of our planet. And if you want to learn even more about the Bering Land Bridge, there's a whole playlist of videos available. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Chapter 3. Life on the Land Bridge. Imagine. It's about 14,000 years ago and you are standing on the Bering Land Bridge. What do you see around you? Well, if you have any experience with documentaries or video games, then you probably immediately conjured up an image of woolly mammoths, shaggy beasts so large that they resemble tanks. But what else is there to see? Are there any other creatures roaming around here? How about some large, long-horned bison? And over there, near that small lake, maybe a woolly rhinoceros. Its 2 horns like scimitars on either side of its head. But if you're not from this time period, then you can imagine whatever you want, because there were no humans around to actually witness the animals that lived on the bridge. At least there weren't any modern humans. There may have been Neanderthals. They were more than capable of making it to North America, across the land bridge. So let's imagine what they might have seen. For starters, there would definitely be mammoths. It's almost impossible to imagine a world at this time without them. But, unlike what you might think, there wasn't just one type of mammoth in North America. In fact, there were 3. The woolly mammoth, the Columbia mammoth, and the Jeffersonian mammoth. The Jeffersonian mammoth was smaller than the other 2, and it died off earlier, but it was still around during the last ice age. The Columbia mammoth was larger than the woolly mammoth, but it had much smaller tusks, and the woolly mammoth was the beast of legends, huge and hairy and well adapted to life in the cold north. And these mammoths would have been joined by other large herbivores, like the woolly rhinoceros, the giant Irish deer, and of course, the bison. Also, the ancestors of today's horses were in North America at this time, and they would have looked similar to modern zebras. That means they would have had stripes. The land bridge would have been covered in grasses, shrubs, and bushes, and these plants would have provided plenty of food for the massive herds that roamed the area. This would have been especially true during the summer months, when the ice receded and the land bridge became a lush grassland. The herds would have traveled back and forth from Asia to North America, following the plants as the seasons changed and the temperatures fluctuated. These migrations would have been awe-inspiring to behold, but they would have also been terrifying. A stampede of hundreds or thousands of animals thundering across the landscape could easily trample a human in their path. The abundance of wildlife would have also attracted large predators, such as the short-faced bear. This creature resembled a polar bear, but it was much larger, and it hunted on the ground instead of in the water. There were also saber-toothed cats in North America at the time, but these were slightly different from the ones in Africa. Their fangs were shorter, thicker and more robust, better suited to piercing the thick fur of their prey. Of course, there were also wolves, which seemed to exist everywhere at this time. In packs, they could take down even the largest of prey. So when you picture the people who may have crossed the Bering Land Bridge, it is important to keep in mind that they would have been entering a world dominated by some of the most ferocious animals that ever existed. Now, when we think of these ancient people, we often imagine them as noble savages, living in harmony with nature and surviving by hunting mammoths. But the reality was probably quite different. They likely wouldn't have lived in one place for very long. Instead, they would have moved around constantly, following the herds and setting up camp wherever they could find shelter. This might mean sleeping in caves, under rock overhangs, or simply building small, temporary huts out of wood and animal skins. Unlike later cultures, they wouldn't have built permanent villages or developed sophisticated hunting techniques. Instead, they would have lived a nomadic lifestyle, moving from place to place as the seasons changed. What's interesting is that these early humans probably wouldn't have been alone. During the last ice age, North America was home to several different cultures. One of the best known is the Clovis culture, named after the site where archaeologists found distinctive stone spear points. These spear points are incredibly well made, suggesting that the people who crafted them were skilled hunters. But there were also other cultures in North America at this time, such as the pre-Clovis people. These early Americans would have competed with each other for resources, and likely clashed in violent territorial disputes. But they would have also interacted with each other, trading goods and ideas. This would have been especially true during the summer months, when the land bridge was fully formed and travel was easy. The Bering Land Bridge would have been a cultural melting pot, a place where people from all over the world came to interact and trade. It's important to remember that while the land bridge was mostly an inhospitable desert, there were also areas that were rich in natural resources. For example, the coasts of both continents were teeming with fish and other seafood, making them a great place to set up camp. Additionally, there were many lakes and rivers on the bridge itself, which would have been stocked with fish. So even though the people who crossed the bridge would have had to deal with harsh weather conditions and dangerous animals, they would have also had access to a bounty of natural resources that could sustain them and their families. This is important to understand because most people think of the Ice Age as a time when humanity was constantly on the brink of starvation, but the truth was more nuanced. Yes, there were times when food was scarce and people had to endure brutal winters. But there were also times when food was plentiful and life was good, and the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge knew this. They would have traveled to the areas that were rich in resources and avoided the areas that were too dangerous or too difficult to traverse. They would have also taken advantage of the plants that grew on the bridge. Berries were an important part of the diet for many ancient cultures, and they would have been a great source of nutrition for the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge. The most common type of berry in this region was the blueberry. But there were also other types of berries that grew in the area, such as cranberries and huckleberries. These berries would have been a great source of vitamins and minerals, and they would have helped the early Americans survive the harsh winters. In addition to berries, the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge would have also had access to a variety of nuts and seeds. These included acorns, hazelnuts, and various types of nuts. These foods would have been a great source of protein and carbohydrates, and they would have helped the early Americans sustain themselves on the journey. Finally, the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge would have also had access to a variety of meats. This included game that they hunted themselves, as well as the meat that they obtained from the herds of animals that they followed. Game was an important part of the diet for many ancient cultures, and it would have been a great source of protein for the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge. Some of the most common types of game that they hunted included deer, rabbits, and other small animals. Overall, the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge would have had access to a variety of natural resources that could sustain them on their journey. While the environment was often harsh and unforgiving, there were also times when food was plentiful and life was good. By taking advantage of the resources that were available to them, such as berries, fish, and game, the early Americans were able to survive the journey and establish new settlements in North America. If you enjoyed this chapter, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. We are continuing our journey through time to find out how people populated the world. Chapter 4. The First Travelers. In the last episode, We discovered that at the end of the Ice Age, the Earth was largely depopulated. Most of humanity died in the cataclysm that ended the ice sheets and flooded the coastal plains, where people had thrived for thousands of years. But there were survivors, and they started to spread out again across the empty land. The question is, where did they come from, and where did they go? As I mentioned previously, the most likely origin point for these early migrants is a place called Bering Land. This is an ancient landmass that existed during the last ice age. It was formed by the falling sea level that exposed a vast plain between Siberia and North America. Some scientists think the first humans set foot here as long as 20,000 years ago. But I'm going to focus on more recent arrivals, because it's just too hard to find evidence from that long ago. So let's talk about the people who arrived in Bering Land about 14,000 years ago, right before the ice sheets melted and the world as we know it today began to take shape. There are two theories about when people arrived in Bering Land. One is that small groups trickled in over the course of many centuries, perhaps even millennia. The other is that there was a big movement all at once. If it was the former, then we might expect to find a few isolated pockets of people clinging to survival in remote places. But we don't see that. All the evidence indicates that people came in large numbers around the same time. This suggests that there was a big migration into Bering Land. But why? The people who lived in Siberia before the migration were hunter-gatherers, probably following herds of reindeer and wild cattle. These animals are still there today, so it's not like they suddenly disappeared. And back then, just like now, there would have been a clear boundary between the forest and the steppe. People could see the trees ending and the grasslands beginning far on the horizon. So it wouldn't have been hard to know what was on the other side of the trees. So why did people cross the forest and head into the unknown? To answer that question, we need to look at the routes they took. There are three possibilities, each with its own challenges. The eastern route goes along the edge of the forest from the Pacific coast of Siberia. The problem with this route is that the coast was a bad place to live. In fact, it still is. Siberia's Pacific coast has always been a frozen wasteland. Even today, there are no cities along that entire coastline. In prehistoric times, the sea would freeze over every winter, making fishing impossible. So if the people coming to Bering Land used this route, they would have had to travel inland right away, which means they would have had to cross rivers, mountains, and swamps, all of which are really bad places to be when you're trying to survive with nothing but the clothes on your back. And I don't think these people had backpacks either. The second possible route went down the Lena River Valley. The Lena is the longest river in Russia, and it would have been a major thoroughfare for people traveling through Siberia. But the Lena has a lot of tributaries, and people would have had to choose one of them to follow. Unfortunately, all those tributaries flow into the Arctic Ocean, which again is frozen over for most of the year, meaning anyone coming this way would have had to turn around long before they reached the coast. The only remaining route would have been west along the edge of the forest, towards the Ural Mountains. This route also had its problems. For most of the year, the ground would have been frozen solid, and while that makes walking difficult, it does make it easier to cross large rivers. But in the summer, the rivers would flood, turning the landscape into a giant swamp. And there's nothing more dangerous than a mosquito-infested swamp, full of biting ants. So why did the people do it? I think the answer lies in the fact that all three routes were equally bad. Maybe it wasn't so much that they had something to gain by moving to Bering Land, but rather that they had everything to lose by staying in Siberia. As the ice sheets melted, the forests grew, and the nomadic lifestyle became more difficult. Perhaps that's why the ancestors of the Native Americans left Siberia. They were pushed out by the encroaching trees. But then why didn't they head east or west after reaching Bering Land? Didn't they know that the land extended in those directions? Well, yes, but it would have taken tens of thousands of years for them to reach the Pacific or the Atlantic. So maybe they didn't bother. Alternatively, they may have known that the land was underwater and not worth exploring. You see, the people who migrated to Bering Land knew things we wouldn't discover until the 20th century. They understood that the Earth was round. Evidence of this comes from a people who share genetic ancestry with Native Americans. Their descendants still live in relative isolation in a small region of northern Siberia, and they tell stories of how their ancestors traveled around the curved Earth. Whatever the reason, it seems that most of the people in Bering Land headed south into North America. This would have been a long and difficult journey. The melting ice would have created huge lakes and rivers that had not yet found their way to the ocean. But eventually, they would have reached the lowlands of the Yukon and the Mackenzie River valleys. Here, they would have found a paradise. The migrating animals would have brought with them berries and nuts. That would have been new to the native plants. There would have been deer, bison, moose, bears, wolves, foxes, rabbits, salmon, trout, and ducks. People could have easily survived here by hunting and gathering. It would have been a little less pleasant, further south, where the climate was warmer and wetter. There would have been no trees, but there would have been plenty of grass, clams, oysters, and seaweed along the coast. People would have hunted horses, camels, bison, elk, and reindeer. In fact, these people would have had such a good life that some scholars speculate that they may have invented agriculture here. Okay, so we know where they came from, and we know where they went. But why did they move? Why did they leave their homes? We can think of three possibilities. The first is that they followed the animals. Reindeer and bison migrate hundreds of miles each year, and they would have been an easy target for people to follow. The second possibility is that the people were fleeing the forest. As the ice sheets melted, the forests crept closer and closer. Maybe the people were driven south by the encroaching trees. The third possibility is that they were curious. Maybe the people who settled in Bering were explorers, the kind of people who, if they saw something on the horizon, would want to go see what it was. All of these possibilities may be true. Humans are complex and we don't always do logical things. Maybe some people followed the reindeer, while others looked for new lands to explore. The important thing to remember is that these people weren't like us. We tend to get attached to our homes. We decorate them with pictures of our friends and family. We put up Christmas trees and menorahs. We fill our walls with souvenirs that remind us of places we've been. But these people didn't do any of that. They lived in tents made from animal hides. Their most prized possessions were the tools they used to hunt. And when their homelands were destroyed, they didn't stop to rebuild. They kept moving south. They didn't know where they were going. They just knew they had to keep moving. And that's why we're here today. If you enjoy this series, check out my podcast about the prehistory of Alaska and Siberia. I'll post the link in the description below. Thanks to my supporters for helping me bring these videos to everyone for free. If you want to help, please consider supporting the series. The more support I get, the longer I can keep this series going. Click here to watch the next episode. Or click here to watch the previous episode. Thanks for watching. Bye. Chapter 5. Tools and Knowledge for Survival. Early man's knowledge of how to make tools and weapons gave him the edge he needed to survive in a hostile world. He used stones for everything from cutting and scraping to digging and crushing. Spears were useful not only for hunting, but also for defense against predators. And the ability to start a fire meant that food could be cooked and warmth provided at night. For clothing, early humans used hides and furs to protect themselves from the elements. They learned how to track animals and navigate through the wilderness. And they developed methods for preserving food that would last for months. This knowledge was passed down from one generation to the next, ensuring the survival of early humans. Hi folks, this is your host. This channel is all about prepping and surviving. Now we are moving forward with our series on early man. And today we're going to talk about Chapter 5, Tools and Knowledge. Let me know what you think about this series so far. Is it helpful? What do you want to see us cover in future episodes? Give me some feedback, and I will try to work on making this series better for you. Early humans had to rely on their wits and their environment to provide them with the materials they needed to survive. They used rocks, sticks, bones, and animal skins to create tools and weapons that helped them hunt, gather food, and defend themselves. In terms of tools, early humans created a variety of stone blades, which they used for a variety of tasks, such as cutting, scraping, and digging. These blades could be made by chipping away at a piece of stone with another rock, until it became sharp enough for use. They also used spears made from sharpened sticks or bones, which were useful not only for hunting, but also for protection against predators. In addition to these weapons, early humans also developed simple fishing tools, such as hooks made out of bone or wood. They may have even used rudimentary catapults to help bring down large animals during hunts. To start fires, early humans practiced various methods such as using sticks to generate sparks by rubbing them together rapidly in a specific fashion known as the bow and drill method. They would create a small hole in the base of a dry stick and insert a sharp piece of bone or stone. Then they would rotate the stick with a bow-like motion, causing the friction from the drill bit to create an ember which would then ignite tinder-like material. Another technique involved placing two stones together and striking them together forcefully to create sparks that could then be used to light tinder. Once a fire was started, it was an invaluable asset that could be used not only for cooking food, but also for providing warmth and protection against nighttime predators. Early humans understood the importance of wearing clothes to stay warm and protect themselves from the elements. They learned to make clothing by taking the hides of animals they had hunted and then using them to create garments. The process of making clothing was not easy, however, and required patience and skill. First, the hide had to be carefully removed from the animal without damaging it. Then it needed to be treated to prevent it from rotting. This was done by soaking the hide in a solution of water and wood ash, which helped break down the hair and make the leather more pliable. Finally, the leather could be cut and sewn together to create a garment. Early humans would use a simple sewing technique that involved using a sharp bone or wooden tool to punch holes in the leather, and then threading a needle made from a sharp stick through the holes. The finished product may not have been very aesthetically pleasing, but it served its purpose of providing protection from the elements. Different cultures had different styles of clothing, but all of them were designed to keep the wearer warm and comfortable. Some groups favored simple loincloths or skirts made from animal hides, while others preferred more fitted garments that covered the torso and limbs. Certain groups even developed the technology to weave fabrics from plant fibers, such as linen and hemp. No matter what style was in fashion, however, every culture understood the importance of dressing appropriately for the weather. In cold climates, people would layer their clothing to trap heat, and in hot climates, they would wear loose-fitting garments made from breathable materials. Overall, clothing was an essential part of life for early humans, and it played a vital role in their survival and well-being. Early humans were skilled trackers, and this allowed them to find food and avoid becoming someone else's food. By studying tracks in the soil or the droppings left behind by animals, they could determine what kind of animals were in the area and whether or not they were a threat. For example, if they found the tracks of a saber-toothed tiger, they would know to stay away from that part of the forest. On the other hand, if they found the tracks of a deer, they might decide to follow it and try to capture it for food. Tracking skills were also useful for hunting. Early humans were able to follow the tracks of their prey and anticipate its movements, giving them an advantage when it came time to strike. They also used their tracking skills to monitor the success of their hunt. If they were tracking a wounded animal, they would want to make sure that it hadn't managed to escape, and they would also want to ensure that their kill hadn't been stolen by another predator. Overall, early humans' tracking skills were an essential part of their survival. It helped them find food, avoid danger, and understand the world around them. Early humans had remarkable navigational skills that allowed them to travel long distances and explore new territories. They developed sophisticated mental maps of their surroundings, which enabled them to find their way back to familiar places after long journeys. Additionally, they used natural landmarks such as rivers, mountains, and constellations to orient themselves and estimate distances. Early humans also developed the ability to use basic tools, such as compasses and calendars, to help them navigate and keep track of time. They observed the patterns of the stars and the phases of the moon, and used them to develop calendars that helped them predict seasonal changes and plan for the future. Early humans also used tools such as knives and chisels to create notches in sticks or stones that could then be used as rudimentary compasses. They would use these compasses to help them keep track of direction while traveling. These navigational skills were crucial for early humans, as they allowed them to explore new territories and find new resources. It also allowed them to avoid getting lost and to plan their journeys accordingly. Overall, early humans' navigational skills were an essential part of their survival and their ability to thrive in a constantly changing environment. Preserving food was a critical skill for early humans who lived in a world where food was often scarce and unpredictable. To keep their food fresh and safe to eat, they developed several techniques for preserving meat, fish, and fruits. One of the most common methods was salting, which involved covering the food in salt to draw out moisture and prevent the growth of bacteria. Early humans also learned to ferment certain foods, such as fruits and vegetables, by leaving them in an enclosed container for several weeks. This process used natural bacteria and yeast to convert the sugars in the food into alcohol and carbon dioxide, which helped to preserve the food and make it safer to eat. In addition to these methods, early humans also used containers made from animal skins or clay to store their food. These containers helped keep food fresh and protected from insects and other pests. By using these methods, early humans were able to extend the shelf life of their food and ensure that they had a reliable source of nutrition, even when food was scarce. Their ability to preserve food also helped prevent starvation and illness, which could have been caused by eating spoiled or contaminated food. Overall, early humans' knowledge of food preservation was an essential part of their survival and their ability to thrive in a constantly changing environment. Early humans had many skills that helped them survive, including tracking, navigation, and food preservation. But perhaps their greatest asset was their ability to learn from their experiences and pass that knowledge down to future generations. This ability to adapt and evolve was what allowed early humans to thrive in a constantly changing world. What skills do you think early humans used to survive? What do you think was the most important skill they had? Let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know what you want to see us cover in future episodes of our Early Man series. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our videos. We'll be back next time with another great preparedness and survival video. Until then, stay safe out there. Chapter 6: A Bridge of Cultures. Humans are super adaptable. We can survive in lots of different environments, but we aren't like chameleons. We don't change our behaviors or beliefs just because we move somewhere new. No, we carry ourselves with us wherever we go. And that includes our languages, traditions, and beliefs. So even when we migrate across the world, we still have a piece of home with us. But how? How do we keep these things alive over thousands of years? Are there any examples of groups who've kept their traditions intact for all this time? Let's find out in Chapter 6, A Bridge of Cultures. Hey there and welcome back to the series. If you're new here, hi, I'm your host. And this is Crash Course Geography, where we try and answer the big how and why questions about our world. In this episode, we're going to talk about migration, and specifically how people carry pieces of their home with them when they move. Now, if you've been watching the series since the beginning, you might remember that way back in episode 1, we talked about how culture isn't something that's static. It changes over time. But we also said that culture can be pretty resilient too. And that's what we're going to focus on today. The ways that people hold on to their cultural traits, especially when they move from one place to another. In geography, the term for this is called cultural retention. And it refers to the preservation and continuation of cultural traits such as language, religion, or customs, despite changes in location or other circumstances. So what are some examples of cultural retention? Well, food is one obvious example. Even if we move somewhere new, we often still cook the same dishes we grew up with. Maybe it's your mom's famous lasagna or your grandma's empanadas. Food is a powerful symbol of home and identity. And when we eat the foods we associate with our culture, it's like we're connecting with our roots, no matter where we are. And we also carry other parts of our culture with us, like music. When we hear a song in our native language, or that reminds us of our homeland, it can bring back a flood of memories and emotions. Language is another powerful way we retain our culture. You only have to spend a few minutes in a neighborhood where your native language is spoken to feel like you're back home. Hearing our native language can evoke a sense of comfort, familiarity, and connection to our heritage that can transcend distance and even time. But retaining aspects of our culture doesn't mean we don't adapt. When we encounter other cultures, our traditions can evolve and mix with local customs to create something new. This is called cultural assimilation, and it happens when people take on the cultural traits of the society they're reliving in. So, while it may not be the same as the traditions we left behind, it's still a part of our overall culture and heritage. So those are some of the ways that we retain and assimilate different parts of our culture when we move. But what about when we don't have a choice? What happens when people are forced to relocate due to conflict, persecution, or natural disasters? Well, it turns out that under these circumstances, cultural retention can actually be a powerful tool for survival. For example, in societies where storytelling was an important way of transmitting knowledge, stories were used as a means of preserving cultural and historical knowledge in the face of forced migration or assimilation. And this is still true today. For example, Aboriginal Australians have maintained their culture through storytelling despite centuries of persecution and forced relocation by the British colonial government. The stories serve as a way to preserve their history, language, and cultural values, and to pass them down to future generations. And it's not just stories. Music has also been an important tool for cultural retention for many groups. For example, in the early 20th century, Irish immigrants in the United States used music as a way to maintain their cultural identity and connection to Ireland. They formed groups called Sealy bands that played traditional Irish music at gatherings and festivals, which helped to keep the culture alive. Similarly, the blues music of African Americans in the southern United States was a way of expressing their experiences during a time of great hardship, and it served as an important part of their cultural heritage. In fact, music and stories are two of the most common ways that people retain their culture. And that makes sense because they're both very easy to share. They don't require any special tools to preserve them, and they can be passed down orally for generations without changing much. That's why songs and stories are so important to many cultures. They help people stay connected to their heritage and share their experiences with others. But it's not just stories and music. Religious beliefs are also something that people will often hold on to tightly, even when they move from one place to another. In fact, sometimes people's spiritual beliefs are what motivates them to migrate in the first place. For example, the Mayflower, which brought the first Puritan settlers to New England in 1620, was motivated in part by a desire to escape religious persecution in England, and more recently, refugees from countries like Afghanistan, Myanmar and Syria often cite religious persecution as one of the reasons they had to leave their homes. When people migrate for religious reasons, they often bring their faith with them, and they may even try to create new communities in their adopted country. For example, many Amish communities in the United States can trace their roots back to small groups of German and Swiss Anabaptists who migrated to Pennsylvania in the 1700s. These groups were persecuted for their religious beliefs, so they fled to a new land where they could practice their faith freely. Today, the Amish are still known for their traditional lifestyle and their strong religious beliefs, which they've held on to for many generations. But how do we know that these groups have retained their culture for all this time? How do we study something as intangible as culture? Well, one way is through oral histories. Oral histories are like stories or interviews that are passed down through generations. They're a great way to learn about a group's history and culture, because they come from people who actually lived through those times. By listening to oral histories, we can hear about a group's migration patterns, their experiences in their new home, and how they managed to retain their culture over time. For example, scholars like Paul Stoller have studied the oral histories of the Wodaabe people in Chad and Niger to learn about their migration patterns and cultural practices. Through these stories, we can hear about their journey from their ancestral lands in the Middle East to their current homes in Africa, as well as how they've adapted to new environments while still holding on to their traditions. Archaeology is another way we can learn about cultural retention. Archaeologists can uncover material remains like tools, pottery, or even buildings that tell us about a group's way of life. By studying these objects, we can learn about their daily life, their religious beliefs, and their cultural practices. For example, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of ancient Puebloan cultures in the southwestern United States that show how these groups built elaborate homes and religious structures that reflected their unique cultural traditions. Despite centuries of change, these cultural elements have endured and continued to shape the region's cultural landscape. By using methods like oral histories and archaeology, we can learn a lot about how cultural traits are transmitted across generations and how they change over time. And this can help us understand how people have been able to retain their culture for thousands of years, even as their environments and circumstances have changed dramatically. But not everyone agrees that cultural retention is always a good thing. Some scholars argue that assimilation is necessary for groups to thrive in their adopted countries. For example, they might say that speaking the local language is essential for economic success, and that adopting local customs is necessary for social integration. Without these things, it can be hard to find work or make friends, and that can lead to poverty, isolation, and even discrimination. So while cultural retention is an important part of preserving a group's identity, it can also present challenges in order to succeed in their new home. Members of migrating groups often need to balance the desire to hold on to their traditions with the need to adapt to a new culture. So there you have it. Some of the ways that people carry themselves with them wherever they go, whether it's through stories, music, food, or even our spiritual beliefs. We can hold on to these pieces of our culture and pass them down to future generations. But it's not always easy. Sometimes we have to balance our desire to hold on to our traditions with the need to adapt to a new culture. But in the end, it's worth it, because our culture is what makes us who we are. Many maps and borders represent modern geopolitical divisions that have often been decided without the consultation, permission, or recognition of the land's original inhabitants. Many geographical place names also don't reflect the indigenous or aboriginal people's languages. So we want to acknowledge these people as traditional and ongoing relationship with that land and all the physical and human geographical elements of it. We encourage you to learn about the history of the place you call home through resources like Native Land CA, and by engaging with your local indigenous and aboriginal nations through the websites and resources they provide. Thanks for watching this episode, which was filmed at a studio and was made with the help of all these nice people. If you want to help keep this content free for everyone forever, you can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. Chapter 7. Seasons of Passage. The rhythm of the seasons dictated the lives of the migrants. The timing of their departure from one seasonal home to another was always done in relation to what the land could provide or take away. When game was plentiful, when plants were full of nourishment, when the skies were clear and windless, they would move. But if the weather turned bad, they had no choice but to stay put until conditions improved. Each season had its own travel challenges and rewards, but all of them were necessary steps in an intricate and ancient dance. The earliest migrations began in the spring. It was a time of renewal, not just for the land, but for the nomadic tribes as well. The cold grip of winter was gone, and life burst forth in vibrant colors and warm temperatures. Families emerged from their winter shelters, eager to reconnect with the rhythms of the open road. The days grew longer, stretching out before them like a vast canvas, promising adventure and opportunity. The temperature climbed, reaching into the 60s and even the 70s, and the sun shone with a warmth that beckoned them to move. As the snow melted, revealing well-worn paths through the grasses, it was a clear sign that the time had come to break camp and venture forth. The migratory instinct pulsed within them, urging them towards the north. Spring was the season of hunts, of chasing the herds across the plains and through the forests. This was a time when the men hunted bison, elk, deer, and other animals that thrived in the open grasslands and wooded areas. These hunts were more than just a means of sustenance. They were a celebration of the return of life, a tribute to the power and majesty of the animals they pursued. With each successful hunt, the men not only provided for their families, but also strengthened their bonds with each other and with the land they traveled. The women gathered berries and roots, supplementing their diet with the bounty of the earth. The children, under the watchful eyes of their elders, learned the skills that would ensure their survival: tracking animals, identifying edible plants, and caring for the tools and supplies needed for their journey. Life on the move was both challenging and rewarding. And in the spring, with the promise of plenty in the air, it was a time for optimism and hope. As the spring advanced, the weather began to warm, reaching into the 80s and even the 90s. This was the perfect time for long marches. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, and the days were so warm that travelers could make good time without having to worry about slowing down to rest. It was a time for exploration, for pushing further and discovering new hunting grounds, new sources of food, and new places to call home for a season. Along the way, they followed streams and rivers, for these waterways were not just sources of water, but also highways to the best hunting grounds. They followed animal trails, signs of where the buffaloes grazed or the deer sought shelter. For these paths were guides leading them to the very heart of the season's bounty. They traded with other tribes they encountered, exchanging stories, tools, and goods. These encounters were more than just commercial transactions. They were a chance to meet new people, learn new skills, and build alliances that could prove invaluable in the months ahead. In this time of plenty, the nomads lived by a simple creed: travel light, move fast, and take advantage of every opportunity. With the sun at its zenith and the land at its most generous, it was a time for bold journeys, new discoveries, and the forging of lasting bonds. But as the summer progressed, the weather began to shift, moving from the 90s into the 100s. This was the season of the long, hot days, when the sun blazed relentlessly from a cloudless sky and the temperatures soared to the point of discomfort. Now the pace of travel slowed. It was too hot to push on, too hot to hunt and gather. Even the animals sought refuge from the heat, making summer a time of scarcity and challenge. Days stretched on endlessly, shimmering in the heat haze, and the lack of rain made every stream and river a precious resource. This was a time for caution, for conserving energy and resources and avoiding the dangers of the midday sun. Summer was a test of endurance, a reminder that life on the Great Plains was not always easy. Still, there was beauty in the harsh landscape. The sky was a boundless blue, unbroken except for the circling hawks, and the resilience of the plants and animals never ceased to amaze. In the midst of the heat, life found a way to not just survive, but thrive. The nomads adapted to the challenges of the season, seeking shade during the hottest hours, traveling at dawn and dusk, and carefully rationing their supplies. They knew that this too would pass, and the rhythm of the seasons would soon bring a change. As the summer waned, the temperature began to drop, signaling the approach of autumn. By September, the thermometer dipped into the 80s. This was the time for final hunts. for one last push to gather enough food to last through the coming winter. As the leaves began to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of red and gold, the nomads felt a sense of urgency. They had to be prepared for the harsh realities of winter, for the biting winds and the scarcity of food. The animals sensed the change in the season as well and began to move, seeking warmer grazing lands to the south. This migration of the herds presented one last great opportunity for the nomads to replenish their supplies. They followed the animals, taking advantage of the rich bounty that autumn provided. It was a time for one last great surge of activity before the stillness of winter settled in. They gathered around the fires, sharing stories and preparing for the long nights ahead. The children snuggled close to their parents, listening to tales of bravery and resilience passed down through generations. As the stars twinkled above them, the nomads felt a deep sense of connection to their ancestors, to the land they traveled, and to each other. The arrival of autumn also marked the start of the annual tribal gatherings. Young men eager to prove themselves would participate in competitions, displaying their skills in hunting, tracking, and fighting. These gatherings were a chance for them to earn recognition, to form alliances, and to ensure the continuation of their tribe's traditions. The women wove new garments, preparing for the cold weather ahead. They mended old clothes, ensuring that no stitch was left undone. Every item was checked and accounted for, ready to face the challenges of the coming winter. The air grew crisp, and the leaves crunched underfoot as the nomads moved into their winter homes. They built sturdy shelters, hunkering down for the long, cold months ahead. Some constructed sturdy wickiups, cone-shaped dwellings made of saplings and covered with earth and grass. Others dug into the ground to create pit houses, their roofs forming cozy domes beneath the earth. Inside these homes, fires burned, chasing away the chill and providing a sense of warmth and security. The rhythmic crackle of the flames mingled with the murmur of family life, creating a symphony of survival and resilience. Winter on the Great Plains was a time of hardship, a test of the nomads' adaptability and tenacity. But as they huddled around their fires, sharing stories and waiting for the return of the sun, they knew that they were more than ready to face the challenges ahead. The wisdom of their ancestors, the strength of their families, and the bounty of the land had prepared them for this moment. And they faced the winter with the courage and determination that had sustained them through countless seasons before. And that is where we end our journey through the seasons with the nomads of the Great Plains. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting us. And don't forget to subscribe for more exciting adventures. Until then, farewell. Chapter 8. The Long Journey South. Bering is the name of the land bridge that connected Siberia to North America about 55,000 years ago. A massive stretch of exposed land connecting the two continents at a time when the ice sheets were at their most extensive and sea levels were at their lowest. It was also the place where the first modern humans arrived in the Americas from Asia, traveling east to west rather than the other way around. And it's here where our story begins today. The group had been walking for several weeks now, following herds of animals south. Their goal was to find warmer weather and more hospitable lands. They knew there was water somewhere to the south, but they didn't know how far away it was, or what lay between them and it. What they did know, though, was that the farther south they went, the warmer it would get, and the more plants and animals there would be. One evening, they made camp near a river. The river was wide and fast, flowing, and crossed by a fallen log. One person, a young man named Tatan, wanted to cross and fish on the other side, but the others said no, it was too dangerous. There were no landmarks to know where they were, and there might not be any people on the other side, only wild animals. Tatan disagreed. He knew that his people had traveled across rivers before, and this one wasn't so wide that they couldn't make it. Plus, they needed food, and fishing on the other side would be much easier if they could build another camp there. Tatan insisted, and after some discussion, the group agreed. Tatan waded into the water and started across the river. Soon the current was up to his waist, then his chest. His companions stood on the shore, watching him struggle against the current. But he was a strong swimmer, and eventually made it to the other side. Tatan found a nice spot under a tree, and built a small fire while he waited for the others. Meanwhile, the rest of the group prepared spears and edged closer to the water. A woman named Ishka held back, afraid to go in. She stayed on the bank and watched the others disappear into the water. Soon the men emerged on the other side, dragging a large fish between them. They had worked together, anchoring themselves to the shore and using long hooks to pull the fish close. That night, the group feasted on roasted fish. Some of the men went back out into the river to spear more fish. As the others ate, They noticed strange sounds all around them. Some were familiar, like the chirping of crickets, but many others they had never heard before. And every so often, a strange shape would pass overhead, silhouetted against the firelight. It wasn't dangerous, just different. In the morning, Tatten woke early and set off to explore. He walked along the riverbank, looking for berries and other plants to bring back to the others. He hadn't gone far when he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was a tall, skinny animal with long neck and legs. It looked like nothing he had ever seen before. Its head was narrow with a small mouth and big, dark eyes. Its fur was gray and shaggy, and it moved with an awkward gait that made him think of a newborn calf. As Tatten watched, the animal bent down to drink from the river. Then it lifted its head and stared directly at him. Tatten froze, unsure what to do. Should he run, call for help, or just stand there and hope the creature didn't charge him? But the animal didn't move. It stood there staring at him for what felt like a long time, then suddenly bolted into the trees. Tatten ran back to the camp and told the others about what he had seen. They didn't believe him at first, but when he showed them the tracks in the soft mud, they knew he was telling the truth. The animal was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was too thin to be a bear, too tall to be a deer, and too strange to be anything else. They continued their journey south, hoping to find other people, or at least some familiar animals. After a few days, they came across a forest and decided to take shelter there. They built huts out of branches and leaves and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the forest. Something big was moving through the trees, crashing branches and snapping twigs. The group huddled together in their shelters, too afraid to go outside. Whatever was out there was too big, too powerful, and it seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, a loud roar echoed through the forest, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The group screamed and threw their spears into the darkness. The next morning, they emerged from their shelters to find a huge bison lying dead in front of them. It had been struck by a spear, and was now slowly being consumed by insects. The group knew that they could kill the bison and eat it, but they didn't want to waste time butchering it. Instead, they left it where it lay and moved further south. They traveled for many weeks, following herds of animals and gathering plants for food. They crossed plains, climbed mountains, and waded through rivers. They saw animals they had never seen before, some that were big and scary, and some that were small and cute. They also saw lots of new plants, some that were familiar, and some that were completely alien to them. They learned to identify the ones that were safe to eat and avoid the ones that could make them sick. One day, they came across a valley filled with tall grass. The valley was surrounded by mountains, and the grass grew so tall that it almost hid the sky. The group decided to camp there for a few days and rest. One afternoon, a group of children were playing by a stream when they saw something amazing. It was a bird unlike any they had ever seen before. It had bright red feathers and a long, thin beak. It hopped around on two legs, pecking at the ground and chirping loudly. The children were so excited that they ran back to camp and told the adults. Everyone gathered around the bird, watching it hop and peck. They had never seen anything like it before. The bird seemed unafraid of them and hopped closer to get a better look. Then it suddenly took off and flew over to a nearby tree. Everyone gasped as they watched it disappear into the leaves. That night, the group sat around the fire and talked about the bird. They wondered where it had come from and what kind of nests it had made. They also wondered if they could catch one and eat it. Some said yes and others said no. But in the end, they decided to wait until the next day to hunt. Early in the morning, the group got up and started tracking the bird. They followed its footprints and the imprint of its beak in the soft mud, until they came to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a tall tree with a large nest made of sticks and leaves. The group crept closer and saw the bird sitting in its nest. Ishka wanted to scare it away, but Tatten stopped her. He wanted to see if they could catch it. So Tatten and a few other men hid near the tree and waited. When the bird flew away, they rushed into the nest and found eggs. That night, the group feasted on roasted eggs. They had never tasted anything like it before. It was salty and rich, and tasted like the best fish they had ever caught. They knew they had found something special, and made a plan to come back later and collect more eggs. The group continued their journey south. They traveled for many months, following herds of animals and gathering plants for food. They saw new animals and plants, some that were similar to what they had seen before, and some that were completely new. They learned to adapt to the changing environment and used what they learned to stay alive. Finally, they reached the coast. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before them as far as they could see. The waves crashed on the shore, and the wind blew their hair and clothes. They had made it. After months of walking, they had reached the end of their journey. But as they stood there looking out at the ocean, they knew that their journey wasn't over. They had crossed Bering and found new lands full of new people, new animals, and new plants. They had seen things that they had never dreamed existed, and experienced things that they would never forget. They had learned to adapt to the changing world around them, and had discovered new ways to survive. Now they had to decide what to do next. Would they stay here, or keep going south? Would they explore the coast, or head inland? The possibilities were endless. And so, the story continues. Maybe they will find other people who have traveled from Asia, or maybe they will be the first to discover the lands beyond the ocean. Maybe they will find new animals to hunt, or new plants to eat. Maybe they will face new challenges and learn new skills. Who knows? All we can say for sure is that their journey isn't over yet. The world is still full of wonders and adventures, and it's up to them to decide what to do next. What do you think they should do? Should they stay on the coast or head inland? Should they explore the ocean, or find other people? It's up to you to decide. So make your voice heard, and let us know what you think. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this chapter in our story. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss an update. You can also follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content and early access to new chapters. Until next time, happy exploring. This is Chapter 9, The Disappearance of the Land Bridge. The last ice age officially ended about 11,700 years ago, when temperatures around the world began to rise. This warming trend lasted for thousands of years, until it leveled off about 8,200 years ago, with the start of the Holocene, also known as the current interglacial period. While the Earth was slowly emerging from its glacial deep freeze, the Arctic region warmed the fastest, causing massive ice sheets to melt and raising sea levels worldwide. At the same time, the Bering Sea at the eastern edge of Asia warmed and deepened, creating an immense ocean trench that ultimately stretched across the entire globe. Over several hundred years, this rising seawater swallowed the land bridge connecting Siberia and North America, and with it, the East Asian and North American populations were separated forever. Now, let's rewind back to the end of the Ice Age and take a closer look at how these dramatic environmental changes occurred. Around 13,000 years ago, the planet had entered the Bullenjedi warming period, which marked the beginning of the end for the last Ice Age. This brief interstadial or warm episode lasted for about 1,000 years, before returning once again to colder temperatures during the Younger Dryas. But the warming that started in the Arctic Circle during this time would not end with the return of the cold. See, the ice sheets covering northern Canada and Alaska had already reached their melting points, so once the temperature rose above those melting points, even a slight increase could only speed up the melting process. Because of this, melting accelerated rapidly and irreversibly. Meltwater flowed northward into the Arctic Ocean, while much of the remaining ice began to flow away from the poles toward lower latitudes. As the climate continued to warm, more and more of the ice sheets began melting. But it wasn't just the north that was getting warmer. Temperatures in Siberia started rising as well, leading to a huge shift in vegetation. About 12,000 years ago, the forest steppe in northern Siberia gave way to forest, which created ideal conditions for wild horses to flourish. Eventually, these horses would be domesticated by humans somewhere in this general area. Meanwhile, in North America, the warming allowed the ice-free corridor to expand southward from the Mackenzie and Yukon valleys, all the way down to the Great Lakes region. It was here where the Clovis culture thrived. Clovis people are best known for their distinctive fluted spear points, made from highly specialized preforms, that were expertly chipped and flaked into intricate projectile points. These masterful stone tools suggest a high level of technical skill and accumulated knowledge about the properties of stone and the technology required to utilize it. But unfortunately, we don't know much else about the Clovis people, because they vanished sometime around 11,500 years ago, perhaps due to a changing climate. In reality, it was the changing climate that played a critical role in the disappearance of the land bridge. You see, the Bering Sea did not exist at this time. Instead, the Bering Strait was a narrow channel of water that separated the two large land masses of Beringer and the rest of Asia. Since the ice sheets were still largely intact, the Bering Strait remained relatively shallow. However, as previously mentioned, melting ice caused sea levels to rise. But what many people fail to realize is that this melting also resulted in a significant amount of fresh water entering the oceans. For example, The ice sheet covering Hudson Bay alone contained over 400 cubic kilometers of fresh water, and eventually, all of this fresh water drained into the Arctic Ocean via the Mackenzie River. In fact, researchers estimate that the influx of meltwater from the Laurentide ice sheet raised global sea levels by almost 200 meters, or 660 feet, and much of this water entered the oceans through the Mackenzie River system, which drained a massive area of the western side of North America. Because of this, the Mackenzie River became the largest river in the world, flowing northward to dump its enormous volume of meltwater into the Arctic. Now, since the Mackenzie River was so wide and full of sediment, it didn't flow very fast. So it took several thousand years to deliver all of its fresh water to the Arctic. But when it was all said and done, the river's influence on sea levels would have an impact on the other side of the world. See, the vast quantity of fresh water entering the Arctic reduced the ocean's salinity, which in turn weakened ocean currents that circulated around the globe. These ocean currents were driven by temperature differences and wind patterns that caused surface waters to flow from east to west. But once the salinity was reduced, the currents slowed significantly, which altered the climate across much of the northern hemisphere. For example, warmer waters normally circulate from the tropics to the poles, but now they were being pushed back south, resulting in a temporary decrease in temperature. But make no mistake, the Arctic was still warming faster than the rest of the world. So even though the influx of fresh water weakened ocean currents and led to a cooling effect elsewhere, the Arctic was still experiencing a rapid rise in temperature, and it was this combination of regional warming and global cooling that allowed the ice sheet covering the former Mackenzie Valley to survive for another 1,000 years. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Bering Strait, the warming climate led to increased precipitation in Siberia. More rain meant that the ground froze less each year, which ultimately led to the formation of large swampy areas filled with organic matter. These swamps were like sponges that absorbed carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which helped to further warm the climate. This feedback loop continued until the ice sheet in the Mackenzie Valley finally melted completely, allowing the sea level to rise even higher. By this point, the Bering Strait had become much wider, but it was still too shallow to serve as a true ocean. The land bridge of Beringer was still intact. However, as the climate continued to warm, more ice-jammed lakes formed in the interior of the ice sheet. And as the ice sheet thinned, these lakes began draining southward through the ice, carving huge channels into the frozen mass. Eventually, these channels reached the Mackenzie River, allowing even more fresh water to flow into the Arctic. With this additional meltwater, global ocean currents weakened even more, which led to a further decrease in temperature elsewhere, while the Arctic continued to warm. Now, there's a good chance that you've heard of the Younger Dryas before. This was another brief period of rapid cooling that occurred about 12,900 years ago, marking the beginning of the final deglaciation in North America. But did you know that this event also occurred in Siberia? Researchers have identified similar evidence of rapid cooling and an abrupt shift in vegetation in northeast Siberia, suggesting that the Younger Dryas also affected this region. During this time, temperatures dropped 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, or 5.4 to 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which caused the permafrost to expand and trees to retreat northward. Once again, these conditions favored a drier and colder climate. However, the cooling only lasted about 1,000 years. After that, the temperature began to rise again, resulting in the complete disintegration of the ice sheets in both Siberia and North America. Now, just imagine the impact that this must have had on the environment. All of that fresh water entering the oceans drastically changed global climate patterns. And when you combine that with the sudden shifts in temperature, it's no wonder why life on Earth has never been the same. Anyway, it's estimated that the sea level rose about 150 meters, or 490 feet, by 11,500 years ago. At this point, the Bering Strait had deepened considerably, and the remnants of the land bridge were submerged. By 11,000 years ago, the sea level had risen another 30 meters, or 98 feet, completely separating the populations of Asia and North America forever. Now, if you're curious about how we know all of this, then you'll love our previous episode on the most accurate dating method used by archaeologists. We go over the science behind radiocarbon dating, and how scientists are able to get such precise dates for ancient artifacts. And if you're enjoying this series, then please consider supporting us. We have some amazing rewards, and you'll help us to reach our goal of reaching 1 million subscribers by the end of the year. Now we can trace human migration across the planet through our DNA. But this wasn't always possible. Hi, it's me, and this is Crash Course Geography, a study of humanity's movement across space and over time. In Chapter 9, we learned how archaeologists used to try to piece together migration patterns by looking at the fossil record. And while paleontologists like Mary Leakey discovered some important pieces of the puzzle, like the partial skeleton of a child in Tanzania, nicknamed Homo habilis, that kid was just one individual from one place at one time. It didn't tell us much about migration patterns across the whole world, so scientists turned to other sources for answers. Today, geneticists can look at the DNA of living humans to see where our ancestors migrated. See, each time a population migrates, they take their genes with them, and over time, genetic differences accumulate between populations. Geneticists have been able to use these differences to map out the general pattern of human migration across the globe. We know that all humans alive today can trace their ancestry back to Africa, so that's our starting point. And we can see how genetic differences accumulated as people migrated. For example, genetic differences between the Han Chinese and the Japanese tell us that the ancestors of the Han Chinese migrated east from Africa into what is now China about 32,000 years ago, while the ancestors of the Japanese migrated around the same time, but stopped in what is now Thailand. They remained isolated there until about 4,500 years ago, when they moved north along the coast of China and then east to Japan. This method of studying migration patterns through genetics has helped solve some mysteries too, like who the heck were the Innu? The Innu are an indigenous people of Japan who share more genetic markers with the Jomon people, the earliest known inhabitants of Japan, than with the Yamato people, the ancestors of the modern Japanese. This genetic link suggests that the Ainu may be descended from the Jomon people, which is weird because according to written Japanese history, the Ainu and Jomon people are completely separate. Written Japanese history says that the Yamato people migrated from the Korean peninsula to Japan around 2,000 years ago and then wiped out the Jomon people. But the genetic record tells a different story, one that suggests the Innu may have been in Japan since the Jomon period and survived the supposed migration of the Yamato people. But while genetic studies help us understand the broad strokes of migration patterns, they don't tell us much about specific routes. That's where archaeology comes in. Archaeologists study the physical remains of past cultures, stuff like pottery, tools, and structures to learn about the daily lives of past societies and how those societies changed over time. By putting these artifacts in context, archaeologists can paint a picture of a culture, including how and why it moved. One theory about the first migration of humans into the Americas is called the Bering theory. Bering was a landmass that connected Siberia and North America during the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago. When the ice melted, the landmass became submerged, and today it's known as the Bering Strait. So the Bering theory says that people walked across the land bridge from Siberia into what is now Alaska, and then spread out across the Americas. Archaeologists have found evidence of this migration in both Siberia and North America. In Siberia, archaeologists found flint and steel tools near an ancient hearth. Flint and steel tools are made by striking a flint rock with a steel core. The sparks that fly off the flint can then ignite dry materials, like grass or cloth. But this technology only appeared in Siberia. After the Clovis culture in North America developed agriculture, so it is possible that early Siberian humans migrated to North America, and then later returned to Siberia with new technologies. And speaking of Clovis, their name actually comes from a site in New Mexico called Blackwater Draw, where archaeologist J.T. Flanagan uncovered distinctive stone tools in 1932. These tools are now called Clovis points. Today, archaeologists have found more than 250 Clovis sites across North and South America, but none in Siberia. All of these Clovis sites date to around 13,000 years ago, right after the glaciers receded and most of North America was still an ice-free desert. This tells us that the people who made these tools probably arrived in North America around the same time that Bering was submerged. But we don't really know when that was. See, the problem with archaeological evidence is that it doesn't preserve well. Only really hard things like stone tools or animal bones survive the natural decay process, and even those things often break down over time. So unless we find something like a perfectly preserved ship, it can be really hard to know how old something is. That's why it's so exciting when we find something like the Preto site in Brazil. In 2014, archaeologist Walter Neves and his team uncovered the remains of a boy at the site. The team carefully examined the bones and determined that the boy was around 12 years old when he died about 11,500 years ago. He had also been ill for a long time before he died, which allowed the archaeologists to tell a lot about his life. For example, they could see that he had been breastfed, indicating that he wasn't living in a nomadic camp, but instead lived somewhere permanent, where his mother could gather wild plants and nuts, and maybe even grow some crops. His body was then buried in a shallow grave under a pile of rocks, suggesting that he had a close family network that cared for him. Even his last meal consisted of fish and shellfish, indicating that he lived near a water source. Together, these clues suggest that the people who lived at Prehistoric had a complex society with close family networks and permanent homes. It was one of the first archaeological sites in Brazil to show this level of complexity. And if the people who buried the boy were descendants of the Clovis people, it shows that Clovis culture was much more widespread than archaeologists thought. But not everyone who lived in Brazil 11,500 years ago came from North America. Some people migrated directly from South America to Brazil. For example, at another site in Brazil called Lagoa Santa, archaeologist Ana Roosevelt and her team discovered the skull of a woman from 14,500 years ago. Her skull showed distinct features of modern humans, not Neanderthals or any other extinct relative of modern humans. The woman's ancestors had probably migrated from Africa, so the two women likely had very different stories. The girl who died at Prehistoric was probably born and raised in North America, while the woman at Lagoa Santa's ancestors had traveled thousands of miles from Africa. But both women contributed their genes to the modern Brazilians, along with everyone else who has ever lived in Brazil over the past 14,500 years. To learn about their stories and the stories of all the people who have ever lived in Brazil, we need to study the physical remains of past cultures and dig deeper into the archaeological record. And luckily, we keep finding more amazing things in the archaeological record, like the Monte Verde site in Chile. In 2017, archaeologist José Caparrós and his team excavated part of a site that had been discovered accidentally 3 decades earlier. The site was special from the beginning because it contained more than 100 tools made from animal bones, a technique called bone napping. But it took years for archaeologists to get permission to excavate the site, because it was on private property. And when they finally got the okay, they had to work quickly. Chilean law requires that archaeologists hand back any privately owned artifacts they find. So Caparrós and his team worked for 2 months to uncover everything they could. What they found was incredible. They found the oldest known shelter in the Americas, consisting of a roof made from animal skins, supported by wooden poles. They also found evidence that the people who lived at Monteverde hunted local animals like guanacos and rheas, and collected shellfish from the nearby coast. But it was the sheer number of artifacts at the site that really shocked researchers. They found more than 15,000 stone tools, hundreds of bone tools, and tens of thousands of animal bones. It was the largest collection of artifacts ever found in South America, and the site itself pushed back the timeline for sophisticated tool use in South America by 4,000 years. To make matters even cooler, archaeologists found clear evidence of multiple occupations at the site over a span of about 1,000 years, meaning that these people weren't passing through. They were living in central Chile. There's still a lot we don't know about the people who lived at Monteverde, but by digging deeper into the archaeological record, archaeologists hope to find out more about their story and the stories of all the peoples of the Americas. Okay, thanks. Bye. Hey there. Welcome back to another episode of Paleo-Logic. In this chapter, we're going to explore some alternate theories about how the first Americans arrived in North America. There are many who believe that the traditional view of the peopling of the Americas is wrong. Whether they're reproposing an alternative route, or an earlier date, or a completely different mechanism for how humans arrived here. This is Chapter 11, Alternate Theories and Debates. As with all controversial topics, it can be difficult to find reliable sources that summarize the current state of knowledge, without letting personal bias influence their reporting. This is my attempt at an objective summary of the current debate surrounding the Bering Land Bridge theory. Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you have access to more recent research, let me know so that I can keep up with the latest developments. And remember, even if you disagree with me, you should still subscribe, because I'm right about most things and I never repeat episodes, so you don't want to miss anything. The coastal migration theory is one of the most popular alternatives to the traditional view of the Bering Land Bridge migration. The theory proposes that instead of crossing the continent via the ice-free corridor, the first Americans migrated along the Pacific coast from near present-day Vancouver Island to California, and then down the coast to South America. The oldest evidence for this idea goes back to the 1960s, when American archaeologist J.D. McNeish argued that the Clovis culture likely originated in Mexico and spread northward, but the most thorough proposal was put forward by Canadian archaeologist Richard D. Martin in 1958. The main problem with the coastal migration theory is that it suffers from the same problems as any other theory that requires people to walk across a large part of the continent. In order for this route to have been passable, there would have to have been a continuous stretch of ice-free land between the Pacific coast and the Rocky Mountains, much like the one that's proposed for the interior of the continent. However, there is no geological evidence for an ice-free corridor along the coast during the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets extended all the way to the coast in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Even if these areas were ice-free, the Columbia River, which would have acted as the migration corridor, had a much lower sea level during the last glacial maximum, making it impassable to humans. Additionally, several mountain ranges would have blocked the path of any potential migrants traveling south from British Columbia. This includes the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the Cascade Range. All of these mountain ranges have deep glacial valleys, but they also have high mountain passes that would have been impassable to humans, especially during the height of the Ice Age. Proponents of the coastal migration theory argued that these mountains may have been passable because of the rain shadow effect that kept the eastern slopes of the Cascades, the Rockies and the Sierras relatively dry, which would have made them easier to traverse. Also, according to sea level curves, the ocean was around 120 meters lower than today, exposing a wide shelf of continental crust that would have allowed for an ice-free corridor along the coast. A team of researchers, led by Oregon State University geologist Brian Atwater, published a paper in 2011 that argues that the exposed continental shelf would have created a low-lying coastal plain 70 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers long that was likely free of glaciers. But the width of this potential migration corridor would have shrunk dramatically as you traveled south. According to their calculations, the plain near San Francisco would have been only 24 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers wide in the Los Angeles area. So if this route was used, the first Americans would have had to swim through the Pacific Ocean in some places, something that we know they were capable of doing, as evidenced by the many modern cultures that have traditions of open water swimming. Another issue with the coastal migration theory is that it doesn't explain why the oldest sites in North America are found further inland. If the first Americans arrived in the Pacific Northwest and then traveled south, you would expect the oldest sites to be found on the coast. But the oldest sites that have been discovered so far are actually thousands of kilometers further inland. We've covered the evidence for early people in northeastern Siberia and Alaska in previous chapters, and we'll talk more about this in chapter 14. But essentially, if you take a straight line from the Siberian coast to the North American coast, the oldest sites we've discovered on both continents align perfectly with that line. The fact that the oldest sites on both sides of the Bering Strait are aligned with each other argues strongly for a direct migration across the straits rather than a coastal migration. So why do some people continue to claim that the coastal migration theory proves that the Bering Land Bridge was not an effective migration corridor? Well, the answer is simple. They haven't done the math. The geometry just doesn't work out. Let's pretend that the coastal migration theory is true and the Bering Land Bridge didn't exist. If the first Americans really did migrate along the coast of North America, then someone would have had to swim from Japan to the Aleutian Islands. It's really that simple. There's no other way to get there unless you use a boat. There is a good deal of controversy surrounding the idea that boats were used in prehistory, largely because we don't have very many examples of ancient boats. Boats tend to break down quickly, so they rarely preserve in the archaeological record. Most of what we know about prehistoric boats comes from a single site in Hungary called Lake Silvaplana. There, archaeologists discovered a large number of dugout canoes and other artifacts dating back to the late Paleolithic. Other boats have been found in places like France and Denmark, but none of these sites are nearly as extensive as Lake Silvaplana. Regardless, proponents of the coastal migration theory argue that if prehistoric humans could build boats in Europe, then they could have easily built boats here too. But the biggest problem with the idea of rafting, or boating to the Americas, is that we don't see any evidence of boats in the archaeological record until after the Clovis culture existed. So it would have to have been invented independently, in two different places, either in Japan or in Siberia. Given the time frame, this seems highly unlikely. The earliest archaeological evidence for boats has been dated to 8,600 years before present, which is well after the estimated arrival date of the first Americans. And while the date of 8,600 years before present may seem close to the estimated arrival date of 13,000 years before present, it's important to remember that archaeology operates on a scale of thousands of years. 8,600 years before present is incredibly early in the history of the Americas. It's not much later than 13,000 years before present. This means that if the coastal migration theory is true, then boats would have had to have been invented and then used to cross the Pacific Ocean within only a few hundred years before Clovis culture emerged. This timeline is extremely unlikely. The last piece of evidence we need to examine comes from the genetic studies that I talked about in Chapter 7. Remember that the deeper the genetic split between modern Native Americans and the ancient ancestors of Native Americans, the older the split. Remember that Population A split from Population B, and Population C split off from the same ancestral population that gave rise to A and B at a more recent time. So Population A will be more genetically different from Population B than they will from Population C. Keep that in mind as we look at this chart. You can see that the deepest split is between the ancient ancestors of Native Americans and the indigenous people of Eastern Siberia. The next deepest split is between the indigenous people of Eastern Siberia and the indigenous people of Japan. This tells us that the common ancestor of all three groups must have lived at least 20,000 years ago. Population C, the indigenous people of Western Siberia, split from the same ancestral population that gave rise to A and B, somewhere between 15 and 18,000 years ago. But the split between A and B, the ancient ancestors of Native Americans and the indigenous people of Japan, is much more recent, somewhere between 14 and 17,000 years ago. This is a pretty narrow range. So if the coastal migration theory is true, then the first Americans would have had to have traveled across the Pacific Ocean within only a few hundred years of when the Japanese split off from the Siberian group. Again, this is extremely unlikely. The Bering Land Bridge theory doesn't have any of these problems. The geometry of the Bering Land Bridge just works better. You can have a group of people migrating across the continent over the course of several thousand years. There's no need for anyone to swim across the Pacific Ocean. There's no need for boats to be invented independently in two separate places. And the dates all fit nicely with the genetic evidence. There are also no geological issues. The ice-free corridor that's required for the Bering Land Bridge migration does exist in the geological record, while the ice-free corridors along the coast do not. Of course, there are still many unknowns surrounding the peopling of the Americas. We don't know exactly how people got to Alaska, for example, nor do we know for sure when exactly they arrived. There are a lot of details that we don't know yet, but the overall picture is clear. The Bering Land Bridge was probably used, and that's the end of Chapter 11. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please leave them in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. This channel is brought to you by a university. Their mission is to ensure that everyone has access to education, and that means you. Their courses cover a variety of subjects, including history, science, computer science, and mathematics. They offer something for everyone. And best of all, it's free. With an unlimited library of classes and new ones added every month, there's always something new to learn. And now you can learn from home on your own schedule. That's the spirit of lifelong learning. Thanks again too for supporting this channel. And thanks to all of you for watching. See you next time. Chapter 12. The Legacy of the First Peoples. After their ancestors had crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into North America, the first migrants spread out across the continent. Eventually, these nomadic hunter-gatherers became the many diverse indigenous cultures that we know about today. But how did this happen? What were their lives like? And how did they respect and care for the land? This is Chapter 12 with your host, Hey there. Okay, let's dive right in. So, over thousands of years, the first migrants split up and spread across the Western Hemisphere, and over time, they became very different from each other. As we learned in Chapter 10, the word indigenous refers to people who were born and live in a particular place. So indigenous peoples are those who were here in North America before European colonizers arrived. They were not all related by blood or genetics, but rather they were united by the fact that they were born and lived on the land, now called the United States. Over time, the various tribes developed their own languages and cultures, while still sharing some common traits, like their respect for nature and oral traditions. Nomadic hunters and gatherers. The earliest peoples in North America were nomadic hunter-gatherers. This means that they traveled around from place to place and hunted animals for food and gathered berries, nuts and fruits that grew wild. They did not farm their own food or raise their own crops. In order to find food, these groups followed the herds of buffalo across the Great Plains, or the salmon as they swam upstream in the Pacific Northwest. As the seasons changed, so did where these groups traveled. In the fall, when the berries ripened, families would head to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, or the Great Lakes region to gather food. During the winter, they would move to areas where wood could keep them warm, and they could hunt small game. And in the spring, they traveled to the riverbanks to fish, or to areas where plants were growing. Families traveled light, bringing only what they needed to survive until they could find more food. An archaeologist who studies Native American history explains that although these groups migrated seasonally following the food sources, they didn't just randomly wander around. Instead, they had an intimate knowledge of their environment and knew where the plants and animals would be at certain times of the year. As time passed, some groups began to stay in one area for longer periods of time. This led to permanent settlements and eventually villages. The village where archaeologists believe the Mississippian culture lived. Archaeologists believe that between 800 and 1600 CE, the Mississippian culture thrived along the Mississippi River in what is now the eastern United States. At its peak, it was home to around 20,000 people. They built large mounds as burial grounds for important members of their society, and as platforms for temples or chiefs' houses. These mounds served both religious and political purposes, demonstrating the power of the rulers who directed their construction. They also farmed the land surrounding their settlements, growing crops such as corn, beans, and squash. Unlike many other Native American cultures, the Mississippians kept their villages clean. They separated their human and animal waste from their living areas, probably to prevent disease. Some archaeologists even think that the Mississippians may have been one of the first societies in the Americas to use a form of democracy. Evidence suggests that the Mississippian people held councils where everyone had a chance to speak and participate in making decisions. In fact, the word for council in many Native American languages means government. The Hohokam people lived in the Sonoran Desert in what is now Arizona, far away from the Mississippians along the Mississippi River. Yet they had much in common with them. Like the Mississippians, they built their villages near farmland where they grew corn, beans, and squash. They also adapted their religion and daily life to the physical features of their environment. The Hohokam were one of the first cultures in North America to farm the desert by building canals to irrigate their crops. These canals brought water from the surrounding mountains to the dry desert floor. The Hohokam also built large ball courts where they played a game that historians believe is the origin of modern basketball and soccer. Archaeologists found evidence that the game involved hitting a small rubber ball through a stone hoop, similar to the game of today. The ball court may have also been used for religious ceremonies and for teaching young men about their culture and history. Sadly, we don't know much about the Hohokam people because they left no written records. Everything we know comes from the artifacts and structures that they left behind. These clues tell us that the Hohokam built large homes made of adobe, a type of sun-baked brick. Their villages grew into towns and eventually into cities, all without the benefit of metal tools. That's because the Hohokam never discovered or traded for metals such as iron or copper. But despite this setback, they created advanced tools from materials that they did have available, like the saguaro cactus. From its spines, they made tools for weaving baskets and containers. And finally, the Hohokam were one of the first cultures in North America to domesticate the horse. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they noted that the Hohokam were excellent horsemen. This shows that the Hohokam were innovators who improved their lives by adapting to their environment and using what they had available. The Inuit and the Pueblo peoples. The Inuit people lived in the Arctic regions of North America, far from the other cultures we've discussed. The Inuit lived in small family groups, traveling with dogs to hunt seals and other marine animals for food. They used boats made from animal skins, stretched over wooden frames to catch fish and other foods. The Inuit adapted to the cold climate by wearing clothing made of animal skins and by building igloos. Igloos were traditionally built from blocks of snow and ice, which were easily obtainable resources in their environment. An igloo could be built quickly and would protect a family from the harsh weather while they were traveling. Inuit culture is rich with stories, songs and dances that were meant to preserve the memories and histories of their ancestors. Storytelling was an important part of daily life. While sitting around the fire, family members shared stories and taught younger generations about their culture, history, and beliefs. The Inuit believed that their entire world was sustained by a great whale. This belief led to a deep respect for all living things and for the environment. Meanwhile, the Pueblo peoples lived in the American Southwest. They settled in the area around 500 CE and built their homes from the hard clay found in the region. These homes were made in a style known as pueblos, which are still standing today. The Pueblo peoples were farmers who grew corn, beans, squash, and cottonwood trees. They also raised turkeys and sheep. They believed that the world was full of spirits and that everything was interconnected. Because of this, they treated all living things with respect and took only what they needed from nature. Their religion was polytheistic, meaning that they worshipped many gods. They believed that each god had a special role in the world, and they held ceremonies to honor them. One of the most well-known ceremonies is the Kushina dance, which celebrates the arrival of spring and the return of the rain. Okay, let's go back in time and meet a member of one of these early Native American cultures. Imagine you are a young girl living in a village in the Pacific Northwest. Your family has traveled here from a neighboring village to trade with others. You walk through the bustling marketplace, the air filled with the smell of cedar, salt, and roasting salmon. Your father talks with another man about his traps and snares, which he will trade for some dried salmon. Then he turns to you and says, "It's time to find your mother." She is over by the longhouse, where the village chief's daughter is teaching a group of girls how to weave. You walk over and sit beside your mother as she teaches a young boy how to make a basket. The three of you talk about how much your family has learned this trip, and you think about how lucky you are to live in a time of peace. As time passes, new technologies arrive in North America, such as metal tools and weapons. And unfortunately, Europeans begin to claim the land as their own. For more on this topic, check out the next chapter. Okay, let's review. Before European colonizers arrived in North America, there were many indigenous cultures living on the land, such as the Mississippians, the Hohokam, and the Inuit. Each culture was unique and had its own language, religion, and way of life. Despite their differences, they all shared a deep respect for the land and all living things. The nomadic hunter-gatherers who arrived in North America thousands of years ago were the ancestors of these cultures. Over time, some groups began to settle down and farm the land, while others continued to travel and hunt. Some cultures built large cities, while others lived in small villages. Still, all of these cultures were shaped by their environment, and all of them respected the natural world around them. Okay, that's what you need to know for this chapter. If you want to learn more about the first peoples, follow the additional resources. If you want to learn more about the indigenous cultures of North America, check out the playlist for more information. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to get notified when the next video comes out. And thanks to the team for making this video. As we close our time in Bering, let's talk about how people today are working to study, preserve, and share the history of this ancient homeland. This is Chapter 13, Bering in Modern Memory. I hope you've enjoyed coming along with me on this journey through Bering over the last few videos. We've explored what science has revealed about this lost world, the clues hidden in the rocks and fossils and ice. And along the way, we've met some of the indigenous people who have lived for thousands of years in Bering's shadow, and whose ancestors were some of the first to make the journey across the Bering Strait. But as we leave Bering, I want to end with a look back. How does the memory of Bering live on today? What are people doing to preserve the history of this special place? In many ways, it's fitting to end our exploration of Bering with a visit to Denali National Park and Preserve in interior Alaska. The name Denali means the Great One in the indigenous Koyukon language. Koyukon people have lived in the area around Denali for thousands of years, and in the 1980s, they asked that the park formerly known as Mount McKinley be renamed to Denali, which had been used by indigenous people for generations. This renaming was finally approved in 2015 after an act of Congress. Today, the park protects more than 6 million acres of Alaska's interior, including part of the Great One. But the reason I'm here is because it's home to the Bering Land Bridge National Preserve, an area of more than 2 million acres set aside to protect the remnants of the Bering Land Bridge. It's one of 7 national parks in Alaska, which together protect nearly 80 million acres. And it's also one of 68 natural and cultural heritage sites in the Arctic Circle that are protected by indigenous and local communities in partnership with national governments and international organizations. In all these lands represent almost a quarter of the Arctic's total area, a vast interconnected system of mountains, forests, grasslands, rivers, lakes, and coastlines that support a rich variety of wildlife and plants, including many species found nowhere else on Earth. For indigenous people, this region has been the foundation of culture and identity for thousands of years. Many of the Arctic's cultural sites are located within these parks and preserves, like this Inupiaq village site on the north slope of Alaska, where archaeologists have dated occupation to at least 1,500 years ago, or this Ethibiscan site on the banks of the Tanana River, where prehistoric tools have been found. These sites speak to the deep history of human habitation in the Arctic and the ingenuity and resilience of the indigenous cultures that thrived here. To learn more about life in Bering, there's no better place to go than the archives of the Anchorage Museum. Here, the past comes alive through stories and artifacts collected from across the state. Some of the exhibits focus on the indigenous cultures of the Arctic, like the Alutiiq, whose ancestors arrived in the Kodiak archipelago from the north, sometime before 3,000 years ago. Their culture developed in relative isolation until Russian traders arrived in the early 1800s. One display showcases a recreation of an Alutiiq winter village, complete with snow houses built of blocks of compacted snow and turf and a boat made of cedar planks. Nearby, there's a demonstration of the Alutiiq practice of weaving sweetgrass, a tradition that dates back thousands of years and continues to this day. One of the museum's most popular exhibits is the Northwest Coast Native American canoes. This collection includes more than 24 canoes and kayaks, built by indigenous people from Alaska, British Columbia, and Washington State. These boats are not only beautiful works of art, but also technological marvels that allowed people to thrive in the Arctic and subarctic environments. Another exhibit that caught my eye was the masks and masquerade ball gowns from the Siberian Yupik. The Siberian Yupik are indigenous to the easternmost part of Russia, near the Bering Strait, and their traditional clothing is designed to keep them warm in the harsh climate of the Arctic. The masks they wore during ceremonies were often made of wood or ivory and decorated with intricate carvings of animals and other figures. A lot of what we know about Bering comes from the Russian Empire, which expanded into the region in the 1700s. When they arrived, they encountered the Chukchi people, who had lived in the area for thousands of years. Over time, the Russians imposed their own culture and language on the Chukchi, but they also adopted some of their customs. One example is the Russian Ushanka hat, which is similar to the Chukotka Turop hat. The Ushanka is a warm fur hat with ear flaps that can be tied at the top of the head. It was originally designed for Russian soldiers to wear in the Arctic climate of Siberia, but today it's worn by people all over the world. As we move further south, the landscape changes from tundra to taiga, and eventually to temperate rainforest. Along the way, we'll see evidence of the impact that humans have had on the environment. From abandoned mining towns to oil pipelines. Eventually, we arrive in Yakutataya, a small town of about 5,000 people. Yakushka is located on the banks of the Yukon River, which flows for more than 2,000 miles from British Columbia to the Bering Sea. The Yukon River is an important part of the Yukon watershed, which drains a large portion of Western Canada and Alaska. While there's no direct evidence of human habitation in Yakutskia, dating back to Bering, archaeological sites nearby suggest that humans have inhabited the general area for thousands of years. Today, the town is home to a number of museums and cultural centers that celebrate the history and heritage of the indigenous people who have lived in the region for generations. One of the most interesting exhibits at the Yukon Museum is the Northwest Company Post, which tells the story of the fur trading company that operated in the Yukon Valley in the early 1800s. The Northwest Company was one of several European companies that competed for control of the fur trade in North America. They established trading posts throughout the Yukon, where they bought furs from indigenous trappers and then shipped them to Europe to be sold. The race to control the fur trade in the Yukon led to a number of conflicts between the European companies and with the indigenous people who lived in the area. But it also had a profound impact on the environment. As the demand for furs grew, so did the number of animals that were trapped and killed. By the mid-1800s, the fur trade had devastated the beaver population in the Yukon and other areas of North America. This led to a decline in the fur industry and eventually the abandonment of many of the trading posts, including the one at Fort Selkirk. Today, visitors to Fort Selkirk can explore the ruins of the trading post and learn about the history of the fur trade in the Yukon. And finally, no trip to Yakutsk would be complete without a visit to the Pioneer Cemetery. This is the final resting place of many of the early settlers who came to the Yukon during the gold rush of the 1890s. The cemetery is a peaceful place to reflect on the history of the region and the people who have lived here over the centuries. As we continue our journey south, the landscape begins to change. The rugged mountains and dense forests of the interior give way to the rolling hills and open tundra of the Arctic coastal plain. The climate also begins to shift, becoming warmer and wetter. This is the traditional territory of the Inupiat, who have lived here for thousands of years. Their way of life is deeply connected to the land and sea, and they rely on the health of the ecosystem to sustain their communities. The Inupiat have a long history of whaling, and today they continue to hunt whales in the Bering Sea using traditional methods passed down from their ancestors. Whaling is not just a means of subsistence, but also a cultural practice that connects the Inupiat to their heritage. The Utqiagvik native village is located on the north slope of Alaska, where the Inupiat have lived for more than 2,000 years. This village is home to a number of archaeological sites, including a whale processing station dating back hundreds of years. This station provides insight into the traditional practices of the Inupiat and their reliance on the marine ecosystem. One of the most iconic features of the Arctic coastline is the ice that forms each winter. This ice plays a vital role in the ecosystem, providing a habitat for a variety of species and shaping the landscape of the region. The Inupiat have a deep understanding of the ice and its importance to the environment. They use it for transportation, hunting, and other aspects of their daily lives. To learn more about the ice and its impact on the Arctic, we can visit the Utqiagvik Native Village Museum. This museum showcases a variety of exhibits that highlight the traditional knowledge and way of life of the Inupiat people. One exhibit focuses specifically on the ice and its importance to the Arctic ecosystem and the Inupiat culture. Through photographs, artifacts, and oral histories, the museum brings to life the dynamic relationship between the Inupiat and the ice that shapes their world. But the Arctic is not just a frozen wasteland. It's home to a surprising amount of biodiversity, from the whales and seals that inhabit the waters to the caribou and polar bears that roam the land. The Inupiat have a deep respect for all living things, and their traditional practices reflect this value. They rely on the bounty of the land and sea to sustain their communities, and they take only what they need to ensure that there is enough to go around. To learn more about the Arctic's biodiversity, we can visit the NANIC, a Center for Arctic Science and Society. This center is dedicated to promoting understanding of the Arctic through research, education, and outreach. Its exhibits and programs explore a wide range of topics, including the Arctic environment, indigenous cultures, and climate change. It's hard to imagine a more remote and isolated place than the Arctic Circle. But even here, people are working to preserve the history and culture of Beringia and the ancient people who called it home. Maybe someday we'll find answers to the many mysteries of Beringia. But until then, we can marvel at the beauty and wonder of this lost world and the people who have called it home for thousands of years. Thanks for joining me on this journey through Beringia. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel for more journeys into history, and leave a comment below to tell me what you thought of the video and what you'd like to see in future episodes. I'll see you next time. Today we're going to do something different. We are going to talk about one of my favorite books. It's called Sapiens, a narrative of humanity's birth, and is written by Yuval Noah Harari. This book has been out for over a decade now, and it was actually recommended to me more than a decade ago. And yet it feels like a brand new book, because the lessons within it have never been more relevant than they are today. In this series, we'll be covering some of the key ideas that are in this book, and how these ideas can help us wake up to our potential. So if you have not read the book, or if you want to give it another go, grab a copy and follow along with us. Chapter 14 covers a few different topics, but the themes that run throughout this entire chapter are resilience, curiosity, and the ability to adapt. In previous chapters, Yuval talks about the cognitive revolution and how this gave our ancestors the mental capacity to migrate across the world. He also talks about the agricultural revolution and how growing food in one place gave humans the ability to stay put and form villages, which eventually turned into cities and then countries. With these two revolutions under our belt, Chapter 14 takes us back to exploring what makes us us, specifically looking at how our curiosity got us where we are today. Humans are perhaps the most mobile creatures on this planet. Most animals are pretty stationary. They live their whole lives in one area. Even if they do travel, it's only for a couple of weeks or months. But humans, we've been traveling for thousands of years. We've explored almost every piece of land that this earth has to offer. But why? What makes us so different from every other creature that can walk or crawl or swim or fly? To answer this question, Yuval goes back to when our ancestors left Africa. Again, about 70,000 years ago. Our ancestors were just one of many different species of humans. Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo florensis. The list goes on. Yet somehow, Homo sapiens became the only surviving species of human. The fossil record shows that this happened sometime after we migrated out of Africa and replaced all of the other human species. But there's no evidence that tells us why. Yuval asks, could it be that the other species of humans went extinct simply because they were weaker, less intelligent, or slower than Homo sapiens? Well, it turns out that this may not be true. Fossil evidence suggests that Homo sapiens didn't start out any stronger, smarter, or faster than the other species of humans. Instead, it seems like it was our curiosity that helped us survive. The cognitive revolution we talked about in Chapter 3 gave us the mental capacity to explore and map the world around us. Language allowed us to share knowledge and collaborate with each other. These two gifts unlocked a superpower within us, the ability to imagine things that did not exist. Using language and imagination, we were able to plan for the future. We could envision new tools and objects and practice using them in our minds before making them real. This unique ability fueled our exploration and colonization of the world. As humans migrated, they encountered completely new environments, climates, plants, animals, everything. For example, migrating to Northern Europe would have been quite a shock. There was snow and ice, and the days had long periods without sunlight. These conditions presented an opportunity for the humans to use their imaginations to come up with new ways of living, new tools and techniques that had never been seen before. If they hadn't migrated, they wouldn't have had the chance to develop these skills and techniques. One of the main reasons humans were able to take over the world is because we adapted to every environment. We learned to hunt and gather in the forest, herd animals on the open plains, farm the land, and grow our own food. Wherever we went, we found a way to thrive. Of course, sometimes we caused mass extinctions, destroying many species along the way. But we managed to adapt to every environment that we came across. Some might say that we took over the world despite our weaknesses. Because we certainly do and have the strength of an elephant, or the speed of a cheetah, or the sharp claws and teeth of a lion. Rather, it was our curiosity and desire to explore that led us to discover and invent new things. Curiosity saved us time and time again. It's thanks to our curiosity that we were able to thrive in so many environments. It's thanks to our curiosity that we invented agriculture and domesticated animals. It's thanks to our curiosity that we created the wheel and then the airplane. It's thanks to our curiosity that we landed astronauts on the moon and launched them into space. Our curiosity has led to so much innovation and change. But what does all this have to do with waking up? Well, one of the things that I love about this book is how Yuval reminds us that humans are more alike than they are different. Yes, there are differences between cultures and religions and nationalities, but the reality is, we are all humans. All humans are capable of curiosity, of exploring the world around them. All humans are capable of innovation and invention. And this is what drives progress, not just for ourselves, but for all of humanity. This can be a hard thing to remember, especially when we see so much conflict happening in the world. But I think it's important to remember that we are all connected, we are all related, and we all have the same capabilities. Because of our curiosity, we are all able to learn and grow and change. Because of our curiosity, we can work together to solve problems and make the world a better place. Because of our curiosity, we can wake up and become the best versions of ourselves. When I think about our collective future, I am worried. Humans have the ability to cause mass extinction, to destroy the world that we live in. But I also believe in our ability to adapt and change. There are so many young minds out there who are curious about the world, and are coming up with incredible ideas and inventions. I think of Greta Thunberg, or David Attenborough, or Jane Goodall, or Brian Johnson. There are so many amazing people doing great things and paving the way for a better future. I think that all humans are capable of greatness. Sometimes we just need a little bit of help getting there. As we move forward in this series, I want you to keep this idea in mind, that we are all connected and we are all capable of incredible things. Now let's do a quick exercise. I want you to think about the last time you were curious about something. You saw something or heard something that sparked your interest. Then I want you to think about what you did with that curiosity. Did you research it online? Did you ask someone else? Did you try to find out more information? Or did you let it go? Chances are that if you're anything like me, you probably let most of your curiosities fade away. You saw or heard something interesting, but you didn't do anything with it. So here's my challenge to you. If something sparks your interest, pursue it. Read a book on it. Watch a documentary. Ask a friend. Try to find out more information. Nurture your curiosity and let it lead you to new discoveries. You never know what you might learn. That brings us to the end of chapter 14. It says a reminder that curiosity is a powerful force that can drive innovation and change. When we embrace our curiosity, we open ourselves up to new possibilities and ideas, and who knows what we might discover. As always, thank you for joining me on this journey through Sapiens. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new. And remember to tune in next time for more. Your journey began in Asia, thousands of miles away from the Americas. The ice-jammed river there had other plans for you, though it swept you up and sent you on your way, not knowing where it would end. You've traveled across frozen wastelands and through deep snows, seen great beasts and spirits, faced dangers untold, and walked where few have gone before. Now you stand at the very edge of your world. Before you, stretching out as far as you can see, is nothing but white. You feel the wind on your face and hear it whispering secrets of the old times, when the world was new and ice held all of the world together. The world has changed since then. Now the ocean roars between the continents, an angry beast that will never let you pass. But look back the way you came. The path is clear. Nothing alive could ever cross this bridge again. You are alone here, and the world, it seems, has ended. What will you do now? What will become of you here in this frozen place? Let the wind carry your cares away. Here in the place where the land ends, you are free of everything. All that is left is the cold and the snow and the long, lonely road behind you. You've come so far, haven't you? The river carried you farther than you ever dreamed you could go. It brought you through the frozen wasteland of northern Asia and into the heart of a frozen continent. There, giants roamed and strange beasts stalked the night. But you survived it all. You saw wonders no one else has seen, heard songs no one else could understand. You felt the cold seeping into your bones and the biting wind tearing at your clothes. Now, it's over. The river has brought you to the end of your journey and to the end of the world. There is no one here. There is no one to hear your story, no one to share your burden, no one to remember your name. You are utterly alone in a world that has forgotten you. The wind whispers tales of a time when the world was young and the ice did not melt. Back then, the great beasts walked freely across the land, unchallenged and unthreatened. Mighty mammoths grazed in herds on the lush grass that grew in the warm sun. Saber-toothed tigers prowled the forests in search of prey. But even they were wary of the woolly rhinoceros, a creature with the thickest hide of all. Its horns were like scimitars, its fur like chainmail. Only the bravest of hunters would dare to challenge it, and even then only for sport, for there was no need to kill such a beast. Food was plentiful, and life was good. Then the ice came and drove all those creatures back into the sea, where some drowned and others froze to death. But not all. Some managed to escape to the south, where the sun still shone warmly and the grass still grew tall. They fled across the ice bridge that spanned the angry waters, driven by the same instinct that drives us all, the instinct to survive. The bridge was long and treacherous. Avalanches roared down its length, crashing into the valleys below. Ice-jammed rivers ran across its surface, too deep to ford and too fast to cross. But the great beasts pressed on. They had to reach the safety of the south before the ice melted completely and the raging seas drowned them all. Among them was a woolly rhinoceros. It charged ahead, its heavy hooves pounding the bridge, its breath forming clouds of vapor in the freezing air. Behind it, a herd of deer followed, their lithe bodies leaping over crevasses in the ice. Their hooves beat a tattoo on the frozen ground, a desperate rhythm that echoed the pounding of their hearts. But suddenly, without warning, the ground split beneath their feet. The ice gave way, and the rhino slipped into the icy water below. It struggled to free itself, its legs churning the water into a frenzy. But the more it struggled, the deeper it sank. With a final snort, it disappeared beneath the waves. One by one, the deer fell in after it, their panicked cries echoing across the empty bridge. Some managed to scramble onto small patches of ice, but they were doomed to die slowly of cold and hunger. Others floated downstream until they were carried out to sea, their forms swallowed by the angry waves. And yet others managed to swim to shore, stumbling onto the beach, exhausted and half-frozen. They collapsed on the sand, unable to go any farther. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and the survivors huddled together for warmth. But the next morning, they were found by hungry wolves and the few remaining humans, who finished what the river had started. So it was that the great herds were decimated, leaving only a handful of survivors. The woolly rhinoceros was among them. It limped along the shore, its head hung low, its spirit broken. The joy of living had been beaten out of it. All it wanted was to lie down and die. It must have walked for days, for weeks, for months. Time means nothing here. The cold is eternal, and the snow never melts. It came across others like itself, driven by the same despair, and they joined the lonely rhinoceros on its endless trek. Together, they stumbled along the shore, their bodies stiff with cold, their eyes glazed with pain. Then one day the woolly rhinoceros stopped. It lifted its head and sniffed the air. Something in the wind told it that this was the place where all suffering would end. It took a last look at the shivering mass of defeated animals behind it and lumbered toward the sea. With a final effort, it plunged into the icy water. It swam out into the middle of the river, then reared up on its hind legs and let out a final bellow. Then it fell forward, its body disappearing beneath the waves. When the river froze over, the others followed the woolly rhinoceros into the sea. One by one, they slipped beneath the ice and vanished. The river ran red with blood, then turned to a sickly yellow as the carcasses floated downstream. Eventually, the river froze and the blood and the yellow turned to white. All trace of the catastrophe was lost beneath the ice. Now the river is a quiet, peaceful place, except for the wind that moans through the trees and the occasional cry of a lonely gull. In summer, the ice melts and the river flows on toward the sea. But in winter, it freezes over and becomes a mirror, reflecting the gray sky above. And when the snow falls, it covers the riverbed and hides the bones of the dead. The woolly rhinoceros is gone, but its spirit lingers here, watching over the river, waiting for the day when the ice will melt and the river will flow south again. On that day, the great herds will return, and with them, the joy of living. Now listen closely, traveler. Can you hear the wind over the snow? Can you feel the cold seeping into your bones? The river is calling you now. It wants you back. It wants you to forget about everything that happened here, everything you've seen, everything you've done. Go back to the beginning. Go back to the life that awaits you. Don't stay here. Don't stay in this frozen place. Don't stay where the land ends. You are not meant to be here. You are not meant to see these things. You are not meant to walk this path. The river wants you back. It wants you to live again. It wants you to dream. Close your eyes. Let the wind carry you away. Let the snow bury your footsteps. Let the river take you home.